The mist clung to Thornwood Manor like a shroud of regret, thick and suffocating, transforming the ancient estate into something spectral and removed from the world of the living. In the West Wing, where the oldest stones held the deepest cold, Lady Helena Ashford stood at the narrow window of her prison, her breath forming ghostly patterns against glass that had not been cleaned in weeks. Perhaps months. She had lost count of such things. The room that held her was grand in its architecture, a testament to the Blackwell family's centuries of power, yet its grandeur had become a mockery. For what use were silk hangings and carved oak when the door was locked from without, and the key rested in the pocket of a man who would not hear her? Her fingers traced the iron bars that crisscrossed the window pane, additions made specifically for her confinement, and she felt the familiar war within her chest, that terrible battle between the defiance that kept her spine straight and the wounded heart that still, despite everything, remembered what it had felt to be loved by him. 3 months she had been here, locked away like a criminal, like something shameful to be hidden, and the injustice of it burned through her veins, even as the November wind found every crack in the stone and chilled her to the bone. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, that distinctive stride that had once made her heart quicken with anticipation, but now filled her with a complex mixture of longing and fury. The key turned in the lock with a sound like judgment, and Duke Sebastian Blackwell entered her prison, his tall frame filling the doorway, his expression carved from granite and shadow. He did not look at her immediately, as though the sight of her pained him, and when his eyes finally met hers, she saw in them the same cold condemnation that had been there the day he had condemned her to this fate. "I trust you are well provided for," he said, his voice formal, distant, the voice of a stranger rather than the man who had once whispered poetry against her skin in the darkness of their marriage bed. "As well as any prisoner might be, Your Grace," she replied, and she heard the edge in her own voice, sharp as winter. "I am not here to quarrel with you, Helena." Her name on his lips was still a caress, despite his efforts at coldness. "Then why are you here at all?" She moved toward him, her grey silk dress whispering against the floor, her dark hair unbound because there was no one to help her dress it properly, no one but the frightened maid who brought her meals and scurried away as though imprisonment might be contagious. "To ensure you understand the terms of your confinement remain unchanged until you confess your betrayal." The words were stones between them. "I have nothing to confess," she said, and her voice broke on the last word despite her determination to remain strong. "Because I have done nothing wrong, and you know it, Sebastian. In your heart you must know it." For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been doubt or pain or the ghost of the love they had shared, but then his jaw tightened and the wall between them rebuilt itself. "The letters are lies," she interrupted, stepping closer still, close enough to smell the scent of him, sandalwood and something darker, something that spoke of sleepless nights and torment. "Someone has deceived you, deceived us both, and you are too proud, too consumed by your wounded pride to see the truth." He turned away from her then, his shoulders rigid beneath the fine wool of his coat, and when he spoke again his voice was barely audible. "I will not be made a fool, Helena." "Then you make yourself one," she whispered to his retreating back, and the sound of the key turning in the lock again was like the closing of a tomb, leaving her alone once more with the mist and the cold and the terrible secret growing within her body, a secret she had tried twice to tell him and twice been refused the opportunity, a secret that would change everything if only he would listen, if only he would see her as something more than the betrayer his pride had convinced him she must be. The marriage had been arranged in desperation, a transaction dressed in the language of duty and honor, though both parties understood the truth beneath the silk and ceremony. Helena's father, the Earl of Ashford, had gambled away his fortune with the same reckless abandon that had characterized his entire life, leaving his family teetering on the precipice of complete ruin, their estate mortgaged beyond redemption, their name about to be dragged through the scandal sheets that fed London's appetite for fallen aristocracy. The Duke of Blackwell, Sebastian, had been recently returned from the continent, a man of 30 years, with a reputation for coldness and an empire of wealth that seemed to have no bottom, and when the marriage broker had suggested the match, Helena had known with a sinking certainty that she was to be sold like a painting or a horse, her value measured not in herself but in what her family name, however tarnished, might add to his consequence. She had expected coldness, had steeled herself for a union of convenience and nothing more, but Sebastian had surprised her, on their wedding night, with a tenderness that spoke of depths she had not anticipated, and in the weeks that followed, something remarkable had bloomed between them, something that felt dangerously like love. He had been attentive, thoughtful, bringing her flowers from the hothouse and books from his library, sitting with her in the evenings as she read aloud, and he pretended to review his correspondence, while really watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For 3 months, she had been happy, genuinely happy, believing that perhaps arranged marriages could transform into something real and lasting, that perhaps she had been blessed by fortune after all. Then had come the morning when she found him in his study, his face white with fury. 3 letters spread across his desk like evidence at a trial, letters written in her hand, or what appeared to be her hand, addressed to Lord Edmund Rothwell, a young baron of questionable reputation, with whom she had danced twice at a ball before her marriage. The words in those letters had been incriminating beyond measure, speaking of passionate encounters, of love that defied the bounds of her marriage vows, plans to flee together once sufficient time had passed to avoid immediate suspicion. She had stared at them in horror and disbelief, recognizing the shape of her writing but knowing with absolute certainty that she had never written such words, had never even thought them, had never given Lord Rothwell more than the polite attention one gave to any dance partner. Her protests had fallen on ears deafened by wounded pride and what Sebastian perceived as irrefutable proof of her betrayal, and when she had reached for him, he had stepped back as though her touch might contaminate him. "I could divorce you," he had said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "I could expose you to all of society, destroy what remains of your family's name, but I will not give them the satisfaction of such scandal, nor will I release you to go to him." The sentence he had pronounced instead was this prison, this locked room in the West Wing, in this living death where she remained his wife in name but nothing more, where she could contemplate her supposed sins in isolation while he nursed his wounds in the cold comfort of his righteous anger. She had begged him to investigate the letters, to question how they had come to be in his possession, to consider that she might be telling the truth, but his pride, that terrible Blackwell pride that ran through his veins like iron, would not permit him to doubt the evidence before his eyes, would not allow him to consider that he might have been deceived by someone else, and so here she remained, innocent and condemned, loving and hated, carrying secrets in her body that he refused to hear. The weeks passed with the relentless quality of water wearing away stone, each day bleeding into the next, until Helena could no longer be certain how long she had been confined in this beautiful prison, whether it had been 6 weeks or 8, or some endless stretch of time that defied measurement. The servants who attended her did so with pitying eyes that spoke volumes about what they thought of the Duke's treatment of his wife, particularly young Mary, who brought her breakfast each morning and lingered longer than strictly necessary, as though human company might be sustenance as vital as the food on the tray. It was Mary who first noticed the changes in Helena's body, the way she had taken to avoiding certain foods that had once been favorites, the pallor that came over her face in the mornings, the subtle rounding of her belly that no corset could entirely disguise, and when the maid had asked with gentle hesitation if her grace might be with child, Helena had felt the truth of it settle over her like a weight both wonderful and terrifying. She had known, of course, on some level she had known for weeks, had felt the changes in her body, the tenderness in her breasts, the strange fluttering sensations that came and went, like whispers of the life growing within her, but hearing it spoken aloud had made it real in a way that sent her to her knees beside the bed, her hands pressed against her still flat stomach, tears streaming down her face as she contemplated the impossible situation in which she found herself. The physician, when Mary smuggled him in through the servants' entrance one grey afternoon, while the Duke was away on business, had confirmed what Helena already knew in her heart, and had delivered news even more astonishing, he believed, based on the size and certain other signs, that she carried not 1 child but 2, twins, a blessing that should have filled her with joy but instead brought a terror so profound she could scarcely breathe. She had tried to tell Sebastian, had sent messages through the servants requesting his presence, had called out to him when she heard his footsteps in the corridor outside her door, but he had refused every overture, had sent word through his butler that he had nothing to say to her. and she had nothing to say that he wished to hear. And as November surrendered to December and the first snows began to fall, covering Thornwood in a blanket of white that made her prison even more isolated, Helena felt despair creeping into the spaces where hope had once lived. The cold seemed to seep through the very stones of the manor, and though the servants kept a fire burning in her grate and brought her warm bricks for her bed, she could not seem to get warm, could not stop shivering, as she stood at her barred window watching the world outside transform into something crystalline and distant, thinking of the children growing inside her body, wondering how she would protect them, how she would give them the love they deserved when their father believed them, born of betrayal, and their mother was locked away like a madwoman in a Gothic tale. And in the darkest hours of the night, when even the fire had burned down to embers and the manor settled into its ancient creaking silence, she would lie awake with her hands on her belly, whispering promises to the tiny lives within her, swearing that she would find a way to give them better than this, that they would know love and safety, even if it meant doing something. She had never before considered that they would be free, even if she had to break every lock and brave every danger to make it so. Sebastian Blackwell sat alone in the vast dining room of Thornwood Manor, a single-place setting before him at a table that could accommodate 20, the candlelight casting shadows that seemed to mock the emptiness of the space and the hollowness in his chest. And he found himself unable to eat despite the elaborate courses the kitchen had prepared, each dish growing cold as he stared at nothing and thought of her, always of her. The image of Helena's face haunting him through every waking hour and invading his dreams when exhaustion finally claimed him. The letters lay in the locked drawer of his study, 3 pieces of paper that had shattered his world, and he had read them so many times that he knew every word by heart, every supposed endearment she had written to another man, every promise that felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Yet something in him, some voice he refused to acknowledge, whispered that the handwriting was not quite right, that the turns of phrase did not sound like her, that a woman who had looked at him with such tenderness could not have authored such betrayal, but his pride would not permit him to entertain these doubts, would not allow him to consider that he might have been wrong, that he might have condemned an innocent woman to imprisonment and isolation based on evidence that could be questioned. Each night he found himself walking past the West Wing, his footsteps slowing as he approached the door that held her captive, his hand sometimes rising toward the lock before he caught himself and forced himself to continue down the corridor, telling himself that she deserved this punishment and that he was being merciful by keeping her here rather than exposing her shame to society. Yet the sound of her weeping through the heavy oak door tore at something fundamental in his soul, made him question everything he thought he knew about justice and righteousness and the proper ordering of a marriage. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, had begun to question his treatment of Helena with increasing directness, her sharp eyes seeing through his justifications and finding them wanting, and at dinner 2 nights past, she had set down her wineglass with enough force to make the crystal ring, and asked him whether he truly believed that locking away his wife like a criminal was the action of a man of honor, whether the letters might perhaps deserve more investigation than he had given them, whether his pride was not blinding him to other possibilities, and he had responded with cold fury, informing her that the matter was not her concern, and that Helena's guilt was beyond question. Though even as the words left his mouth, he had tasted their bitterness and known them for the defensive shields they were. The loneliness was becoming unbearable, a physical ache that settled in his bones and made the vast manor feel like a mausoleum, and he realized with dawning horror that he still loved her, that despite the letters and the supposed betrayal and all his righteous anger, his heart had not released her, that some part of him was dying in her absence, even as he maintained the fiction that he was the wronged party, deserving of sympathy and vindication. And in the deepest hours of night, when sleep would not come and the darkness pressed close around him, he found himself wondering whether he had made a terrible mistake, whether his pride had led him to destroy the one thing in his life that had brought him genuine happiness. But morning would come, and with it the hardening of his resolve, the renewal of his determination not to be made a fool, not to admit doubt or weakness. And so the cycle continued, day after day, with him growing more hollow and more haunted, while she remained locked away above him, both of them prisoners in different wings of the same cold house. Clara Brennan had served at Thornwood Manor for 3 years, long enough to know which of the household staff could be trusted and which would carry tales to the butler for favor, and from the moment she had been assigned to attend to the imprisoned Duchess, she had felt a burning sense of injustice at the situation that grew stronger with each passing day, as she witnessed Helena's quiet dignity in the face of such cruel treatment. The other servants whispered about the letters, about the supposed infidelity, but Clara had seen the way the Duke looked at his wife in the early days of their marriage, had witnessed the tenderness between them, and something in her gut told her that the entire situation was wrong, that a woman who carried herself with such grace and spoke with such gentle sadness could not be the adulteress she was accused of being, and so Clara began to bring extra portions at meals, slipping sweet biscuits into her apron pocket from the kitchen, staying longer than necessary to brush Helena's hair or tidy the room, offering the companionship that might make the isolation slightly more bearable. It was during one of these extended visits, as December frost painted patterns on the windows, and Clara was helping Helena into a fresh nightgown, that she noticed the subtle changes in her Grace's figure, the way the fabric pulled differently across her belly, and the fullness in her breasts, and when their eyes met, Clara saw the truth written plainly in Helena's expression before a single word was spoken, saw the fear and wonder and desperate need for an ally, and she had immediately drawn the younger woman into an embrace and whispered that whatever was needed, she would help, that she would not abandon her to face this alone. Helena had wept then, great shaking sobs that seemed to empty her of weeks of pent-up terror, and through her tears she had confessed everything the twins growing inside her, her failed attempts to inform the Duke, her terror of what would become of her children if she remained imprisoned, her growing conviction that she would need to escape if she hoped to give them any kind of life, and Clara had listened with a heart that broke and mended and hardened into determination all at once, and she had made a promise that would change both their fates, that she would help Helena get away from Thornwood, that she would gather what was needed for such an undertaking, that she would risk her position and perhaps more to see justice done. The planning began in whispers and stolen moments, Clara using her connections below stairs to slowly accumulate the things Helena would need. Coins pilfered a few at a time from the household funds she helped manage, warm clothing suitable for travel that might go unnoticed from the storage rooms, information about the guards' schedules and the weak points in the manor's defenses, the location of a hidden passage in the west wing that had been used by servants for generations and might provide an escape route if properly timed. She recruited carefully, speaking only to those she trusted absolutely, finding allies in Thomas the stablemaster, who had served Helena's family before her marriage and still felt loyalty to her house, in Mrs. Pemberton, the head cook, who had grandchildren of her own and could not stomach the thought of babies being born in captivity, in young James, the footman who had lost his own sister to a cruel husband and saw in Helena's plight an echo of that tragedy, and together they began to weave a network of support that would make the impossible merely extraordinarily difficult, gathering resources and information while maintaining absolute secrecy, knowing that discovery would mean dismissal at best and criminal charges at worst, yet none of them wavered, bound together by the shared conviction that what was being done to the Duchess was unconscionable and that they had a moral duty to help her, even if it meant defying the master of the house and risking everything they had built in service to Thornwood Manor. Helena's strength had been waning for days, the pregnancy taking its toll on a body already weakened by weeks of captivity and the emotional devastation of her circumstances, and when she woke one morning unable to rise from her bed, her limbs trembling and her vision swimming with dark spots, Clara had immediately sent for the household physician, despite knowing that such an action would bring the Duke's attention to matters Helena had desperately tried to keep hidden from him. Dr. Whitmore arrived within the hour, his examination brief but thorough, and Helena watched the concern deepen in his weathered face as he took in her pallor and the unmistakable curve of her belly beneath the bedclothes, and when he left the room, she knew with terrible certainty that her secret was about to be exposed, that whatever fragile control she had maintained over her situation was about to shatter like glass beneath a hammer's blow. She was correct in her premonition, for Sebastian intercepted the physician before he could even descend the main staircase, demanding to know the nature of his wife's illness with an urgency that surprised them both, and when Dr. Whitmore informed him that the Duchess was with child, indeed carrying what appeared to be twins based on the size and movement he had detected, The Duke's face went through such a transformation of emotions that the elderly doctor took an involuntary step backward, watching shock give way to confusion, give way to something that looked almost like hope, before rage swept over all of it, like a crimson tide. Sebastian dismissed the physician with barely coherent thanks and strode directly to the west wing, his footsteps echoing through the corridors with such force that servants scattered before him, and he stood before Helena's door, with his hand pressed flat against the wood, as though he could reach through it to grasp the truth that seemed to shift and dance just beyond his comprehension. And when he spoke, his voice shook with barely controlled fury that masked the terror and uncertainty roiling beneath it. "You are with child," he said, not a question but an accusation, and Helena, who had pulled herself upright in her bed despite her weakness, felt her own tears begin to fall as she confirmed what he already knew, her voice breaking as she told him yes, she carried twins, his sons growing inside her, even as he kept her locked away like a criminal, even as he denied her the basic dignity of his presence or his hearing, and she heard him draw a ragged breath on the other side of the door, before his next words came like daggers designed to find her heart and pierce it through. "How am I to know they are mine?" he demanded, his voice rough with anguish and accusation intertwined, and Helena felt something fundamental break inside her at those words, felt the last fragile hope that he might someday believe her innocence crumble into dust, and through her tears she told him that she had never betrayed him, that she had loved him from the moment of their wedding, that the children she carried were his and his alone. But her words seemed to bounce off the locked door without penetrating to wherever his heart had hidden itself behind walls of pride and wounded honor. The confrontation continued in fractured exchanges through the barrier of oak and iron. Sebastian's accusations met with Helena's increasingly desperate pleas, until finally she fell silent, her tears spent, and in that silence she felt a transformation occur within her soul, a crystallization of resolve that burned away the last remnants of the yielding, hopeful woman she had been, and she understood with absolute clarity that she could not stay, that for the sake of the innocent lives growing inside her, she must find the courage to leave this place and the man who had once promised to cherish her, but had instead become her jailer. And when she spoke again, her voice held a quality of cold determination that made Sebastian press his forehead against the door in unconscious supplication. "I will not let my children be raised in this prison," she told him, each word carefully measured and irrevocable. And on the other side of the door the Duke of Thornwood felt the ground shift beneath his feet, felt the terrible premonition that he was losing something infinitely precious. But his pride would not let him unlock the door, would not let him fall to his knees and beg her forgiveness, and so he walked away while Helena sat in her bed and placed her hands on her rounded belly and made a silent promise to her unborn sons that she would be brave enough for all of them, that she would find a way to freedom, even if it cost her everything else she had ever known or loved. The days following Helena's declaration became a careful choreography of preparation and deception, Clara moving through the manor with particular attention to appearing normal, even as she coordinated the growing conspiracy with the precision of a general marshalling forces for battle, and it was during one of her whispered conferences with Thomas in the stable yard that she learned something that changed the entire complexion of their understanding. For the old groom had overheard a conversation between the Duke's cousin Richard and a man Thomas did not recognize, a conversation in which Richard had drunkenly boasted about the forged letters that had destroyed the Duke's marriage, laughing about how easily Sebastian had been manipulated and how the path to the title would be clear once the disgrace drove the Duke to madness or self-destruction. Thomas had immediately brought this intelligence to Clara, who felt her blood run cold with the implications, for here was proof of Helena's innocence, proof that could change everything, yet she made the agonizing decision not to tell the Duke, reasoning that a man who had so readily believed the worst of his wife would likely dismiss the word of servants as fantasy or conspiracy, and that even if he believed them, his pride might demand he maintain his position rather than admit such a catastrophic error, and more crucially, that any revelation might tighten security and make escape impossible. So she told only Helena, who wept with bitter vindication and renewed determination, understanding that she was fleeing not just imprisonment, but a web of lies that went deeper than she had imagined, that the man who had betrayed her trust was himself a victim of betrayal, though that knowledge could not heal the wound his lack of faith had carved into her heart. The network of sympathetic servants grew more organized with each passing day, Mrs. Pemberton ensuring that extra provisions were set aside and wrapped for travel, James the footman mapping out the guard rotations and identifying the precise window of time when the eastern gate would be least watched, and gradually they settled upon the ideal opportunity for escape. The Duke's annual winter ball scheduled for the 15th of December, when the manor would be filled with guests and staff would be too busy managing the festivities to notice one slight figure slipping through the shadows, when music and champagne would provide cover for the sound of doors opening or horses being readied in the distant stables. Helena's physical condition remained precarious. Dr. Whitmore visiting twice more and each time expressing concern about her pallor and weakness, recommending rest and nourishment that she accepted with gratitude, even as she secretly forced herself to walk the length of her room each day, building what strength she could for the ordeal ahead, knowing that she would need every ounce of endurance to survive a winter journey while heavily pregnant with twins. Yet her determination never wavered, for she would press her hands to her belly and feel the flutter of movement there, and know that she would crawl through snow and darkness if necessary to give these innocent souls a chance at life beyond these walls. The ball drew closer, preparations consuming the household's attention, and on the night before, Clara brought Helena the traveling cloak and sturdy boots they had hidden, the small purse of coins that represented Thomas's life savings offered freely, and a detailed plan of their route through the servant passages to the stables where a horse would be waiting, and as Helena listened to these final arrangements, she felt fear and hope war within her chest, knowing that tomorrow night she would either find freedom or face consequences too terrible to contemplate. Yet when Clara asked if she was certain, if she had the courage to go through with something so dangerous in her condition, Helena met her eyes with a gaze that held all the fierce protectiveness of impending motherhood, and said yes, that she had never been more certain of anything, that she would escape Thornwood Manor or die trying, for she would not let her sons be born in a prison built of lies and wounded pride. The night of the ball arrived cloaked in winter darkness, frost etching delicate patterns on the windows of Thornwood Manor, while inside the great halls blazed with candlelight and echoed with the strains of the orchestra, the cream of society swirling through the ballroom in their silks and jewels, champagne flowing and laughter rising to the vaulted ceilings, as Helena sat in her locked chamber, listening to the distant music, and feeling her heart hammer against her ribs with anticipation and terror in equal measure, knowing that within the hour she would either be free or discovered, and facing consequences she dared not imagine. Clara arrived as the clock struck 9, her face flushed from running up the servant stairs, and she helped Helena into the traveling dress they had hidden, the dark wool chosen for its warmth and its ability to blend into shadows. And as Helena's trembling fingers fastened the buttons over her swollen belly, she felt one of the twins kick as if in protest or encouragement, and she whispered a silent prayer to whatever gods might listen, that she would have the strength to see this through, that her body would not fail her children when they needed her courage most. They moved through the west wing with Clara leading the way, her lamp shuttered to emit only the barest sliver of light, and Helena followed with one hand trailing along the wall for balance, and the other pressed protectively to her belly, each step requiring conscious effort, as her weakened body protested the exertion, and twice they froze in alcoves as guards passed nearby, their boots heavy on the stone floors, and their voices carrying snatches of conversation about the festivities below, and Helena held her breath until the darkness swam before her eyes, certain that her thundering heartbeat must be audible to anyone within a dozen yards. The servant passages were narrow and steep, designed for staff to move unseen through the manor's infrastructure, and Helena had to stop 3 times to rest, her breathing labored and sweat beading on her forehead despite the December cold, while Clara whispered encouragement and promises that they were nearly there, nearly to freedom, and when they finally emerged into the winter night through a door hidden behind the kitchen gardens, Helena gasped at the shock of icy air filling her lungs and looked up at a sky scattered with stars that seemed impossibly bright after weeks of seeing nothing but the ceiling of her prison. Thomas waited in the shadows of the stable with a gentle mare already saddled, and he pressed the reins into Helena's hands, along with a purse that clinked with coins. His weathered face creased with concern as he took in her pallor and the way she swayed on her feet, and he offered to ride with her at least to the nearest village, But Helena refused, knowing that his absence would be noted and punished, and instead she let him help her into the saddle, gasping at the pain that shot through her back and abdomen as she settled her weight. And then she was moving through the darkness with the manor's lights falling away behind her, following the lane that led through the estate's parkland toward the London road, and every stride of the horse sent jolts of discomfort through her body. But she did not slow, could not slow, driven by the knowledge that discovery could come at any moment, and that her only chance lay in putting as much distance as possible between herself and Thornwood before dawn revealed her absence. The night stretched endlessly, marked by the rhythm of hoofbeats and her own labored breathing, the cold seeping through her cloak and making her muscles clench and tremble, and twice she had to stop to retch at the roadside, her body rebelling against the punishment she was forcing upon it. But each time she climbed back into the saddle and pressed onward, thinking of her sons, imagining them safe and free and growing up in sunshine rather than shadow. And when the first grey light of dawn began to pale the eastern sky, she saw the blessed sight of the coaching inn rising from the morning mist, its windows glowing with warmth and promise, and she slid from the horse more than dismounted, her legs nearly buckling as her feet touched the ground, and stumbled toward the door, knowing that she had done it. She had escaped, though the hardest part of her journey was yet to come. The journey to Willowmere took 3 days that felt like an eternity, Helena travelling by public coach because she dared not draw attention by hiring a private conveyance, enduring the jarring roads and the curious glances of fellow passengers who noted her condition and her obvious distress with varying degrees of sympathy and suspicion, and each mile was purchased with pain as her body protested the constant motion, and her twins seemed to sense her distress, their movements more agitated than usual, pressing against her ribs and making it difficult to breathe. Yet she never once considered turning back, for every rotation of the wheels carried her farther from Thornwood's shadow and closer to the one person in the world she trusted absolutely. Lady Margaret Sutton, who had been her dearest friend since childhood, the sister of her heart if not her blood. She had written no letter of warning, fearing interception, and so when the coach finally deposited her at the gates of Willowmere on a grey December afternoon, with snow beginning to fall in lazy spirals from a leaden sky, she simply walked up the drive on trembling legs, her cloak pulled tight against the cold, and her small bag clutched in one hand, and when the butler opened the door and recognized her, his eyes widened with shock, before professional training reasserted itself, and he ushered her into the warmth of the entrance hall, sending a footman running to fetch Lady Margaret, who appeared moments later in a flutter of muslin and ribbons, her pretty face transforming from curiosity to horror to fierce protectiveness in the space of a heartbeat as she took in Helena's haggard appearance and obvious pregnancy. Margaret asked no questions in that first moment, simply gathered Helena into her arms with a fierceness that spoke of years of friendship and loyalty, and Helena felt something break inside her chest, all the fear and pain and desperate courage that had sustained her through escape and flight, suddenly giving way to exhaustion so profound it seemed to pull her down like a stone sinking into dark water, and she heard Margaret's voice, as if from a great distance, calling for her physician and her housekeeper, and demanding that the best guest chamber be prepared immediately, and then the world tilted and went grey at the edges, and she knew nothing more until she woke in a soft bed with firelight dancing on unfamiliar walls, and Margaret sitting beside her, holding her hand with tears streaming down her face. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of recovery. Dr. Morrison visiting twice daily to monitor her condition and pronouncing it a miracle that she and the babies had survived such an ordeal, prescribing rest and nourishment and absolute calm, all of which Margaret provided with the devotion of the truest friendship, never pressing for details of what had brought Helena to her door in such a state, but simply offering sanctuary and love, and gradually Helena found her strength returning, her body responding to safety and care in ways it never could have in captivity, and as the weeks passed and winter deepened into its coldest months, her belly grew round and prominent, the twins thriving now that she could rest and eat properly, and breathe air untainted by the poison of betrayal. She told Margaret everything one evening as they sat before the fire in Margaret's private sitting room, the whole sordid tale spilling out like poison from a lanced wound, the forged letters, and Sebastian's terrible accusations, and the long weeks of imprisonment and her desperate escape. And Margaret listened with a face that cycled through shock and rage and sorrow, and when Helena finished, she simply said that Helena would stay at Willowmere as long as she needed, that she would be safe here, and that her children would be born in peace and raised in love, and Helena wept with gratitude and grief intertwined, mourning the marriage that had died, even as she felt her sons quicken with life beneath her heart. Sebastian discovered her absence at dawn when his mother insisted he visit Helena's chamber to discuss the matter of her pregnancy, a conversation he had been avoiding for 2 days since learning of it from Dr. Morrison, and the moment he unlocked the door and saw the empty room with its neatly made bed and open wardrobe, he felt his heart stop in his chest, the world tilting sickeningly as he stood frozen in the doorway, before rage exploded through him like wildfire, sending him bellowing through the halls for his steward and his guards, demanding to know how a pregnant woman could simply vanish from a locked room in the dead of night. And within the hour, every servant in Thornwood Manor stood assembled in the great hall while Sebastian paced before them like a caged beast, his voice raw as he questioned each one with increasing desperation about what they had seen or heard. And it was Clara who bore the brunt of his fury when he noticed her red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands, pressing her with questions until she wept but revealed nothing. Her loyalty to Helena stronger than her fear of his wrath, though he threatened dismissal and worse. He sent riders in every direction with descriptions and orders to check every coaching inn and posting house within 50 miles, offering rewards for information and making it known that the Duchess of Blackwell was not fleeing scandal, but had been taken ill and wandered away in a state of confusion, a lie that tasted like ash on his tongue, but seemed necessary to preserve what remained of both their reputations, and he himself rode to London to question Helena's family, only to find they knew nothing and seemed genuinely shocked by her disappearance, her father's face grey with worry and her mother dissolving into hysterics, and Sebastian left them with promises to find her and bring her safely home, though he had no idea how he would fulfill such assurances. It was on the 3rd day of frantic searching that his cousin Edward appeared at Thornwood, the same Edward who had always seemed too eager to discuss the succession and too interested in the Duke's affairs, and Sebastian received him in the study with barely concealed impatience until Edward's trembling voice and downcast eyes penetrated his distraction, and the confession that spilled forth made Sebastian's blood turn to ice in his veins, as Edward admitted through tears that he had forged the letters, hired a clerk to mimic another man's hand, planted them where Sebastian would find them, all in some twisted hope that a childless divorce might somehow clear Edward's path to the title, a scheme so contemptible and foolish that Sebastian could barely comprehend it, even as fury unlike anything he had ever known rose up to choke him. He struck Edward with enough force to send him sprawling, then stood over him, shaking with rage and something far worse than rage, a dawning horror that made his stomach heave as he realized what he had done, how he had condemned an innocent woman, imprisoned his own wife, accused her of betrayal when she had been faithful all along, and the baby, dear God, the baby she carried, his child, his children, and she had tried to tell him and he had refused to listen, had called her a liar and worse, and now she was gone, fled into the winter, with his sons growing in her belly, and no way to know if she was safe or suffering or even alive. He banished Edward from England itself, with threats of prosecution if he ever returned, then collapsed into his chair and wept for the first time since childhood, great wrenching sobs that tore from his chest as he confronted the magnitude of his failure. And when his mother found him thus, she held him as she had when he was a boy and listened to his broken confession, and together they began a search in earnest, hiring investigators and writing to every connection they possessed. But weeks passed with no word, no trace, as if Helena had simply vanished from the earth, and with each day that brought no news, Sebastian felt another piece of himself crumble away, his arrogance and certainty replaced by desperate remorse and the terrible knowledge that he might never have the chance to beg her forgiveness or know his children, that his pride had destroyed everything that mattered, and he was powerless to undo the damage he had wrought. Helena's labor began on a morning in late March, when the first crocuses had pushed through the last patches of snow, and the air carried that peculiar quality of early spring, a half-promise and half-memory of winter's grip, and she woke to a tightening across her belly that she knew immediately was different from the practice pains that had troubled her for weeks. And Margaret was summoned at once along with Dr. Morrison, who had been staying nearby these last days in anticipation of this very moment, and what followed was a trial that lasted through the entire day and deep into the night. Her body locked in the ancient struggle of bringing forth life, while her mind drifted between present agony and fragmentary memories of Sebastian, wondering if he searched for her still, or if he had already forgotten her in the arms of some more compliant woman. And she wept, not only from physical pain, but from the sorrow of knowing her sons would enter a world where their father's name was both their birthright and their burden. Margaret held her hand through every contraction, her face pale but determined, whispering encouragements and pressing cool cloths to Helena's burning forehead. And Dr. Morrison worked with the steady competence of long experience, though his expression grew increasingly grave as the hours wore on and Helena's strength began to flag. And it was near midnight when the first child finally emerged with a cry that seemed to pierce straight through to Helena's soul, a sound of pure life and indignation that made her laugh even through her tears, and the physician announced a healthy boy with dark hair like his father's, and Helena held him for only a moment before the next wave of labor claimed her, and she had to surrender her firstborn to Margaret's trembling arms while she fought to bring his brother into the world. The second twin came more quickly, but the effort left Helena spent and shaking, her body pushed beyond what she had thought possible. Yet, when Dr. Morrison placed the second squalling infant on her chest beside his brother, she felt a surge of fierce joy so powerful it eclipsed even her exhaustion, and she looked down at the two perfect beings she had created, their tiny fists waving and their faces red with the outrage of birth. And she whispered to them that she would protect them always, that they would know love even if they never knew their father, that she would be enough for them somehow, though she had no idea how to make such a promise true. She named them in the quiet hours before dawn, as they nursed at her breast with that instinctive hunger that needed no teaching, calling the elder Alexander for strength and the younger Theodore for the divine gift they represented. Names she chose without consulting anyone because they were hers alone to name, and their father, having forfeited that right when he locked her away and refused to believe her truth. And yet even as she made this decision, she felt the phantom weight of Sebastian's absence like a missing limb, wondering what he would have chosen, whether he would have been gentle with these fragile new lives or as harsh as he had been with her. The weeks that followed brought a transformation Helena had not anticipated, her body slowly recovering while her heart opened in ways she had not known possible. The love she felt for her sons vast and uncomplicated, and pure in a way that her love for Sebastian had never been. And she found herself smiling again for the first time since her wedding day, real smiles that came unbidden when Theodore made a funny face or Alexander gripped her finger with surprising strength, and Margaret delighted in her role as honorary aunt, helping with late-night feedings and morning walks in the garden when the weather permitted, and together they created a small, peaceful world at Willowmere, where Helena began to believe she might actually build a life, might raise these boys to be good men who would never doubt a woman's word or confuse love with possession. And as spring deepened into summer, and her sons grew round and healthy, she made a conscious choice to stop waiting for Sebastian to find her, to stop hoping he would arrive with apologies and explanations, instead pouring all her energy into the present moment and the two small lives that depended on her completely, deciding that this would be enough, that she would make it enough, even as some traitorous part of her heart continued to ache for the man who had betrayed her trust so thoroughly that forgiveness seemed an impossibility she would never have to confront. The months that followed Edward's confession became a crucible in which Sebastian's very nature was tested and transformed, and his wealth and position proving useless against the simple fact that Helena had vanished as completely as morning mist burned away by sun. And he threw money at the problem with increasing desperation, hiring investigators throughout England and even sending inquiries to the continent, though he had no reason to believe she would flee so far, selling off parcels of land and precious heirlooms that had been in his family for generations to fund the search, because what did any of it matter if he could not find her and beg her forgiveness, could not know if his children lived or died, could not undo the terrible wrong he had committed in his arrogance and pride. Society watched his decline with the peculiar mixture of sympathy and schadenfreude that characterized the Tun's relationship with fallen greatness. Whispers following him through ballrooms, he attended only to question guests about possible sightings, rumors spreading that the proud Duke of Blackwell had been brought low by his own cruelty, and he made no attempt to control the gossip or preserve his reputation, even going so far as to publicly admit his error at a dinner hosted by the Marquess of Winchester, his voice breaking as he confessed to the assembled company that he had wrongly accused his wife of infidelity based on forged evidence, and that she had fled while carrying his children, and he begged anyone with information to come forward, offering rewards that made the other guests exchange uncomfortable glances while his mother sat beside him with tears streaming down her face. The Duke, who had once held himself with such rigid dignity, now walked through London with shoulders bowed, as if carrying invisible weight, his face gaunt from sleepless nights and missed meals, his eyes holding a haunted quality that made even his critics feel a stirring of pity, and he began attending services at St. George's every morning, kneeling in the dim sanctuary long after other worshippers had departed, his lips moving in prayers that begged not for Helena's return but simply for knowledge that she lived, that his children breathed, that he had not destroyed them all with his stubborn refusal to believe her innocence. His mother became his sole comfort during these dark months, the Dowager Duchess opening her home to her broken son and sitting with him through long evenings when grief threatened to consume him entirely, listening as he spoke obsessively about small moments from his brief marriage that he had failed to treasure at the time. The way Helena's eyes lit when she laughed, the softness of her voice when she read poetry in the garden, the courage it must have taken to maintain her dignity even while imprisoned. And gradually through these conversations, Sebastian began to understand that he had never truly known his wife at all, had seen only what his pride allowed him to see, rather than the remarkable woman she actually was, and this recognition completed the destruction of his former self, leaving behind someone humbler and infinitely more aware of his own capacity for error. He stopped attending social functions entirely by autumn, spending his days riding through the countryside on the slim hope of catching some trace of Helena's passage, and his nights writing letters to her that he would never send, pouring out apologies and confessions onto page after page that piled up in his study like monuments to his remorse, and his household staff watched this transformation with wonder, the harsh master they had feared becoming someone capable of thanking them for small services and asking after their families, as if losing Helena had cracked open some sealed chamber in his heart and allowed his humanity to finally emerge. Though he would have gladly remained the arrogant fool he had been if it meant she would return, if it meant his sons would know their father, if it meant he could have one more chance to prove himself worthy of the trust he had so carelessly shattered. The seasons turned at Willowmere with a gentleness that seemed designed to heal wounded hearts, summer giving way to autumn in a gradual cascade of gold and crimson that transformed the estate's gardens into something from a pastoral painting, and Helena found herself settling into a rhythm of days structured entirely around Alexander and Theodore's needs, their small bodies growing sturdy and strong on her milk, and Margaret's cook's nourishing broths that were pressed upon her with maternal insistence, and she discovered within herself reserves of patience and joy she had not known existed, as she watched her sons learn to focus their eyes and track movement, and eventually to smile those gummy grins that made her heart swell, with such fierce love it was almost painful. Margaret proved herself not merely a friend but a sister in all but blood, rising for midnight feedings without complaint, and walking the floors with a fussy twin so Helena might sleep an extra hour, and together they created a small universe at Willowmere where the outside world's judgments and expectations could not penetrate, though Margaret did occasionally attempt to introduce Helena to suitable gentlemen from neighboring estates, widowers or second sons who might offer respectability and security, and each time Helena refused with a gentle firmness that puzzled her friend, until one evening she finally admitted that her heart remained stubbornly attached to Sebastian despite everything he had done, that she could no more transfer her affections to another man than she could will herself to stop breathing, and this confession hung between them like a ghost that explained everything about Helena's lingering sadness, even in moments of contentment. As autumn deepened and the boys approached their first birthday, Helena began to notice the ways they resembled their father, Alexander, inheriting Sebastian's strong jaw and serious expression, even in infancy, while Theodore had his father's eyes, and that particular shade of grey-green that could appear cold as winter or warm as spring depending on the light, and these resemblances brought both comfort and pain, making Sebastian's absence feel more acute, even as she tried to convince herself that she and the boys were better off without a man who had proven himself capable of such cruelty. Though late at night, when the house was silent and the twins slept peacefully in their cradles, she would lie awake and wonder what he was doing, whether he had remarried or taken a mistress, whether he ever thought of her, or if his pride had allowed him to simply erase her from his memory, as one might burn an unflattering portrait. The morning Theodore spoke his first word, a garbled approximation of mama that nevertheless was unmistakable in its intent, Helena experienced a joy so profound it brought tears streaming down her face, and Alexander followed suit within days, as if unwilling to let his brother achieve any milestone alone. And these small triumphs made Helena acutely aware that her sons were growing up without their father, that they would one day ask questions she did not know how to answer, that her desire to protect herself from further pain might be denying them something essential to their identity and inheritance, and this realization grew into a certainty that settled over her like snow, cold and inevitable, the understanding that she could not hide at Willowmere forever, no matter how safe and peaceful it felt, that her sons deserved to know their father if he had truly changed, as she sometimes allowed herself to hope he might have. And with this recognition came a decision that terrified her even as she acknowledged its necessity, the knowledge that she would have to reach out, would have to risk her hard-won peace and the fragile happiness she had constructed, and would have to discover whether the Duke of Blackwell had learned anything from the wreckage of their marriage, or whether he remained the same proud, suspicious man who had locked her away and refused to believe her truth. And as the first frost touched Willowmere's gardens, and the twins celebrated their first birthday with sticky fingers and delighted laughter, Helena sat down at Margaret's escritoire and began to compose a letter that would change everything once more. The letter Helena composed took 3 attempts before she achieved the delicate balance between revelation and protection, her hand trembling as she addressed it, not to Sebastian himself, for she could not yet bear direct communication with the man who had caused her such pain, but rather to the Dowager Duchess Eleanor Blackwell, a woman Helena had known only briefly during her short marriage, but who had shown her small kindnesses that suggested a gentler nature than her son possessed. And in careful script, Helena explained that she lived safely in the countryside, under the protection of a dear friend, that she had given birth to twin sons who thrived and grew more beautiful each day, and that she wrote now, not out of forgiveness, but out of a mother's understanding that her boys deserved to know their heritage and their father, if he had truly changed, as she sometimes dared to hope, and she sealed this missive with wax that bore no identifying mark, before entrusting it to Margaret's most discreet footman, with instructions to post it from London rather than the local village. The Dowager Duchess received Helena's letter on a grey November morning as she sat in her private sitting room at the London townhouse, and the sight of unfamiliar handwriting caused her heart to leap with sudden irrational hope before she even broke the seal. And as she read the careful words, tears began streaming down her face in rivers of relief and joy, for she had spent these long months watching her son destroy himself with grief and guilt, had prayed every night for some sign that Helena lived, and that the grandchildren she had never met drew breath somewhere in England. And now here was proof of God's mercy, written in elegant script, that revealed her daughter-in-law's location, while also making clear the fragility of this first reaching out, the tenuous nature of Helena's willingness to allow any contact at all. Eleanor did not pause to inform Sebastian of the letter's arrival, but instead immediately ordered her coach prepared and set out for Willowmere within the hour, bringing only her lady's maid and leaving instructions with her butler to tell the Duke upon his return from another fruitless search expedition that she had been called away on urgent family business, and the journey of 2 days felt interminable as she imagined the reunion ahead. Wondered what her grandsons looked like, whether they resembled Sebastian or Helena or some perfect combination of both, and she clutched the letter to her chest like a talisman against all the months of uncertainty and fear. Helena received word of the Dowager's imminent arrival with a mixture of relief and trepidation, suddenly questioning the wisdom of reaching out at all, wondering if she had set in motion events that would shatter the peaceful existence she had built at Willowmere. But Margaret squeezed her hand and reminded her that courage sometimes meant risking safety for the possibility of something greater, and when Eleanor's carriage finally rolled up the drive, Helena stood on the front steps with Alexander on one hip and Theodore on the other, her son's weight grounding her as the older woman descended with surprising speed for someone of her years and station. The Dowager Duchess stopped 3 feet away, her eyes moving from Helena's face to the baby's and back again, and tears began flowing anew as she whispered, "My dear child, my precious girl, thank God you live, thank God." And Helena found herself weeping as well, stepping forward into an embrace that somehow included all 3 of them, the twins making confused sounds between the 2 women who clung to each other like survivors of separate shipwrecks, finding each other on the same desolate shore, and Eleanor pulled back only to gaze at her grandsons with wonder, reaching out tentative fingers to touch Alexander's cheek, and then Theodore's, murmuring prayers of gratitude in a voice thick with emotion. They retired to the drawing room where Margaret had thoughtfully arranged for tea and privacy, and there Eleanor held each boy in turn, marveling at their sturdy limbs and bright eyes, and then she turned to Helena with an expression of such pleading hope that Helena felt her careful defenses begin to crack, and Eleanor spoke of Sebastian's transformation, his public humiliation willingly embraced, his selling of treasured possessions to fund the search, his nightly vigils in churches, begging not for Helena's return, but simply for knowledge that she breathed, and she described a man so thoroughly changed from the arrogant duke who had imprisoned his wife that Helena struggled to reconcile the 2 images, and Eleanor took Helena's hands in her own aged ones and begged her to give Sebastian one chance to prove himself worthy of her forgiveness, to allow him to meet his sons and demonstrate the man he had become through suffering. And Helena sat in silence for a long moment, while her heart waged war with her caution, before finally, slowly, she nodded her consent. Eleanor departed Willowmere the following morning, with promises to send word to Sebastian immediately, and Helena spent the next 3 days in a state of heightened anxiety that manifested in restless pacing and an inability to settle to any task, her mind conjuring endless scenarios of their reunion, ranging from his tearful contrition to renewed accusations. Though Margaret reminded her repeatedly that Eleanor would not have spoken so highly of Sebastian's transformation if it were not genuine. And still Helena found herself checking her reflection obsessively in the mirror, wondering if the months of motherhood had aged her beyond recognition, if he would find her changed in ways that disappointed or repelled him, and she rehearsed speeches in her mind that ranged from coldly formal to tentatively forgiving, without finding any words that felt adequate to the magnitude of what lay between them. Sebastian received his mother's urgent summons while staying at a coaching inn outside Manchester, the latest in a string of dead ends in his search for Helena, and he read her brief note, "Come to Willowmere in Hertfordshire immediately. Your wife and sons await you there." With hands that shook so violently he nearly dropped the paper, and he departed within the hour without bothering to collect his belongings or settle his account, riding through 2 days and 1 night with such desperate speed that he wore out 3 horses and arrived at the village of Willowmere, looking like a madman, his clothes disheveled and his face drawn with exhaustion and terror that this might be some cruel hoax or that Helena might refuse to see him even now. Margaret insisted on being present for the reunion, positioning herself as both witness and protector, and she arranged for the meeting to take place in Willowmere's formal drawing room at precisely 4 o'clock on a grey December afternoon, and Helena dressed with trembling hands in a simple day dress of pale blue muslin, refusing Margaret's suggestion of something grander because she would not dress to impress the man who had imprisoned her, and she held Alexander in her left arm and Theodore in her right as she waited in the drawing room, their solid weight the only thing keeping her anchored to the floor as her heart threatened to beat its way out of her chest. The sound of hooves on gravel announced Sebastian's arrival, and Helena felt her breathing become shallow and rapid as she heard the front door open and the murmur of voices in the entrance hall, Margaret's calm tones and Sebastian's deeper voice rough with emotion, and then the drawing-room door opened and he stood on the threshold, and Helena's first thought was that Eleanor had not exaggerated his transformation, for the proud duke who had locked her away had been replaced by a man who looked as though he had been broken and reassembled from fragments, his face gaunt and lined with suffering, his eyes holding a haunted quality that spoke of sleepless nights and relentless guilt, and he was staring at her with an expression of such naked longing and anguish that she felt something crack inside her chest, despite all her careful defenses. Their eyes met across the expanse of Persian carpet and expensive furniture, and the world seemed to contract to just this moment, just this space between them, filled with everything they had lost and everything they might yet salvage. And Sebastian's gaze moved from her face to the babies in her arms, and to Alexander's serious expression and Theodore's curious wide eyes, and she watched him take in the undeniable evidence of his sons, saw his face transform with wonder and devastating grief as he whispered, "Helena," and the single word contained within it every apology he had not yet spoken, every moment of suffering they had both endured, and Helena stood frozen, unable to move toward him or away, holding their children like a shield against the tidal wave of emotion that threatened to drown them both. Sebastian took 3 unsteady steps into the room before his legs seemed to give out beneath him, and he fell to his knees on the Persian carpet with a sound that was half sob and half prayer. His proud head bowed, as though the weight of his guilt had finally broken him completely, and Helena watched this collapse with her heart hammering against her ribs, uncertain whether to feel vindication or sorrow at the sight of this once imperious duke reduced to such abasement, and his voice when it came was hoarse and broken as he whispered, "Forgive me, God help me, Helena, forgive me," the words tumbling out in a desperate torrent that seemed to bypass all the careful speeches he must have prepared during his frantic journey. And she stood frozen in place, holding their sons as Sebastian raised his head to look at her with eyes that were red-rimmed and swimming with tears, and he continued, "I destroyed everything, destroyed you and destroyed us, and I have no right to ask anything of you, no right even to breathe the same air. But please, please let me at least see them. Let me look upon the sons I nearly lost through my own damnable pride and stupidity." And Helena felt her own tears begin to fall, though she had sworn to herself she would remain composed, would not give him the satisfaction of seeing how deeply he could still affect her. Margaret moved from her position by the window to gently take Theodore from Helena's right arm, understanding without words that Helena needed her hands free for whatever came next, and Helena shifted Alexander to a more secure position against her shoulder as she took 2 hesitant steps toward where Sebastian knelt, and she watched his face transform as she drew closer, watched wonder and anguish and desperate love chase across his features as he got his first clear view of Alexander's serious grey eyes, so like his own, and the dark curls that marked him unmistakably as a Blackwell, and Sebastian reached out one trembling hand before stopping himself, his fingers hovering in the air between them, as though he feared his very touch might contaminate this innocent child who had every right to despise the father who had abandoned him before birth. Helena's voice emerged smaller than she intended, fragile as spun glass, as she asked the question that had haunted her through all the long months since her escape. "The letters, Sebastian. Tell me about the letters." And she watched him flinch at her use of his name, the first time she had spoken it directly to him since that terrible night when he had condemned her through a locked door, and he swallowed hard before answering, "Forgeries. Every damned one of them was a forgery created by my cousin Edward, who thought to inherit my title if our marriage ended in scandal and disgrace, and I was such a fool, such a blind, arrogant fool that I believed them without question. I believed the worst of you rather than trusting the woman I had sworn to cherish and protect." And his voice broke completely on the last words, and he pressed his fist against his mouth, as though trying to physically hold back the sobs that threatened to overwhelm him. Helena felt something shift inside her chest, some small crack appearing in the careful walls she had built around her wounded heart, and she found herself asking, what became of him, of Edward? And Sebastian's expression darkened with a fury that was somehow tempered by exhaustion, and he replied, "Banished from England with nothing but the clothes on his back and enough coin to reach America, though I wanted to challenge him to a duel, wanted to make him suffer as you suffered. But my mother convinced me that you would not want more bloodshed on your account, that revenge would not undo the harm already done." And he looked up at her with such raw vulnerability that she had to look away, had to focus on Alexander's small hand clutching at her dress, and Sebastian continued in a whisper, "I sold the Blackwell emeralds, the ones that have been in my family for 6 generations, sold them to fund the search for you, and I would have sold everything, the estate itself, my very title, if it meant finding you and begging your forgiveness, even if you could never grant it." And Helena's tears fell faster now, dropping onto Alexander's dark curls as Margaret quietly brought Theodore closer so that Sebastian could see both of his sons, and he gazed at them with an expression of such profound love and devastating regret that Helena felt her carefully guarded heart begin, just barely, to thaw. Sebastian took a room at the Rose and Crown in Willowmere Village, refusing Margaret's offer of guest quarters at the estate because he understood without being told that Helena needed the security of knowing he could not simply appear in her chambers unannounced, that she required the power to control when and how often she saw him. And so he arrived each morning at precisely 10 o'clock and departed each evening at 6, establishing a rhythm that was both torturous in its restraint and necessary for the delicate work of rebuilding what his pride had shattered. And Helena watched from the morning room window each day as his carriage approached, her heart performing that same confusing dance between anticipation and trepidation, between the memory of the man who had imprisoned her and the evidence of transformation she witnessed in these careful, patient visits. The first days were awkward beyond measure, filled with stilted conversations in Margaret's drawing room, where they discussed safe topics like the weather and the twins' sleeping habits, while avoiding the chasm of pain that yawned between them. But gradually, Sebastian began to relax into a role Helena had never seen him occupy, that of devoted father, and she watched with something like wonder as he knelt on the nursery floor to stack wooden blocks for Alexander's serious inspection. As he walked the length of the gallery with Theodore balanced against his shoulder, singing off-key lullabies that made the baby gurgle with delight, and these moments of pure paternal joy seemed to crack something open in Sebastian's carefully maintained composure, seemed to reveal glimpses of the man he might have been if arrogance had not poisoned his capacity for trust. Helena found herself studying him when she thought he was too absorbed with the twins to notice, cataloguing the changes that suffering had wrought in his features, the new lines bracketing his mouth that spoke of months spent frowning. The silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, though he was barely 30, the way his hands trembled slightly whenever he held his sons, as though he feared they might vanish like smoke if he did not maintain perfect control. And she realized with a pang that resembled grief that she had loved the Duke Sebastian had been. Imperious and commanding and so certain of his place in the world, but she might come to love this humbled version even more deeply if she could find the courage to risk her heart again. They took to walking in Willowmere's winter garden after the twins' afternoon nap, wrapped in heavy cloaks against the December chill, and it was during these quiet perambulations that real conversation began to emerge. Hesitant at first, and then flowing more freely as Sebastian spoke of his months searching for her, of the crushing guilt that had become his constant companion, of the night he had knelt in a country church and begged God for a chance at redemption he knew he did not deserve. And Helena listened with her hands buried in her cloak pockets to keep from reaching for him, and she found herself answering his gentle questions about her pregnancy and the twins' birth, about the terror of labor without him beside her, about the first time she had held their sons and felt simultaneous joy and devastating sorrow that he was not there to share the moment. There came an afternoon in the conservatory when Sebastian was showing Theodore a particularly vibrant orchid, and Helena stood close enough to catch the familiar scent of his cologne, and their hands brushed as they both reached to steady the baby, and the contact sent such a shock through Helena's system that she gasped audibly, and Sebastian's eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, and for a suspended moment she thought he might kiss her, wanted him to kiss her with a fierceness that terrified her, but instead he stepped back with visible effort and cleared his throat and suggested they return to the nursery, and Helena spent that night lying awake, wondering whether she was grateful or disappointed that he had maintained such careful boundaries, her heart at war with her hard-won caution, knowing that forgiveness was a country she was traveling toward but had not yet reached, though perhaps she could see its borders shimmering on the horizon. The fever came in the depths of night 3 weeks into Sebastian's careful courtship of reconciliation, and it was Theodore who fell ill first, his small body burning hot enough that Helena felt the heat radiating through his nightgown when she lifted him from his cradle during a routine check, and her heart seized with the particular terror known only to mothers as she called for Margaret and sent a footman racing to the village inn to fetch Sebastian. And by the time the Duke arrived, still fastening his coat over his nightshirt, his hair wild from sleep and his eyes wide with fear, Helena had already stripped Theodore down to his smallest clothes and was bathing his fevered skin with cool cloths while the baby whimpered and thrashed in her arms, and Sebastian took one look at his son's flushed face and glassy eyes before he moved without hesitation to Helena's side, and he said in a voice that trembled only slightly, "Tell me what to do, and tell me how to help." And she directed him to fetch more cool water and clean cloths, and together they worked through the long watches of the night in a partnership born of shared desperation, their earlier awkwardness forgotten in the face of their child's suffering. The physician arrived with dawn's first light and examined Theodore with grave efficiency before pronouncing it a fever of the lungs that might break within hours or might worsen into something far more dangerous. And he left powders and instructions and warnings, and Helena felt her knees weaken with terror, but Sebastian caught her elbow and guided her to the chair beside Theodore's cradle, and he said with quiet certainty, "I will not leave you. I will not leave either of you. Not tonight and not ever again if you will permit it." And Helena nodded because she could not speak past the fear choking her throat, and so they settled into vigil, taking turns holding Theodore against their chests so he could feel their heartbeats, speaking to him in soft murmurs about the future they promised him, about the horses he would ride and the books they would read, and the brother who needed him to fight and survive. Sebastian prayed aloud as midnight approached again, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and emotion, and Helena watched through her own tears as this proud duke, who had once seemed carved from marble, wept openly while begging God for his son's life, promising reformation and devotion and anything, everything, if only Theodore would be spared. And she realized in that moment that whatever barriers remained between them had become gossamer thin, and that the man kneeling beside this cradle, bearing his soul before heaven, was not the Sebastian who had locked her away in rage, but someone transformed by suffering into a version of himself capable of true humility and love. The fever broke just as the winter sun crept above Willowmere's eastern gardens, and Theodore's small body went limp with the sudden release of tension, and his temperature began to drop beneath Helena's hand, and she let out a sob of relief that seemed torn from her very soul, and Sebastian made a sound that was half laugh and half cry as he reached to touch his son's cooling forehead with trembling fingers, and then they were looking at each other across the cradle, with all their defenses finally completely shattered, and Helena found herself rising from her chair at the same moment. Sebastian stood, and they met in the space between furniture with a collision that was both desperate and gentle, and she collapsed into his arms as he pulled her against his chest, and she felt his whole body shaking with the force of his relief and gratitude, and she whispered against his throat, "I forgive you, Sebastian. God help me, but I forgive you." And his arms tightened around her almost convulsively as he buried his face in her hair and wept like a man who had been holding back an ocean, and when he finally lifted his head to look at her, his eyes swimming with tears and something that looked terrifyingly like hope, she reached up to cup his face in her hands and drew him down into a kiss that tasted of salt and redemption, a kiss that spoke of new beginnings emerging from the ashes of their destruction, and he kissed her back with a reverence that made her heart ache and soar simultaneously, and she knew in that moment that they had finally, after so much pain and separation, found their way back to each other through the crucible of their love for the children they had created. They departed Willowmere on a morning touched with early spring promise, the frost melting from the grass as the first carriages were loaded with trunks and nursery supplies, and Helena stood on the front steps with Theodore in her arms and Alexander clinging to her skirts, while Sebastian supervised the careful packing of their belongings, and Margaret wept openly as she embraced Helena one final time and whispered that she had prayed for precisely this ending, that love might prove stronger than pride and pain. And the journey to Thornwood took 2 days, because they traveled slowly to accommodate the twins' needs for frequent stops and feedings, and Helena found herself watching the familiar countryside roll past the carriage windows with a complicated mixture of emotions, remembering her desperate flight along these same roads carrying unborn children and terror in equal measure, and now she returned as Sebastian's true wife, with their sons nestled between them and his hand clasped firmly around hers as though he feared she might dissolve if he released his grip. Thornwood emerged from the morning mist like a vision reborn, and Helena gasped audibly when she saw that the ivy, which had once choked the west wing, had been torn away to reveal honey-colored stone glowing in the sunlight, and the windows she remembered as dark and shuttered now stood open with lace curtains billowing in the breeze, and as their carriage rolled up the circular drive, she could see the entire household staff assembled on the front steps. And when Sebastian handed her down from the carriage with Theodore in her arms, while a footman carried Alexander, the servants broke into spontaneous applause, and Mrs. Pembroke, the housekeeper, rushed forward, with tears streaming down her weathered face, to beg Helena's forgiveness for not having done more to help her during those terrible weeks of imprisonment, and Helena embraced the older woman and assured her that the past was forgiven, that they were building something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. Sebastian led her through rooms transformed by love and intention, showing her the nursery he had designed himself with 2 cribs carved from oak and painted with scenes of horses and gardens, and a schoolroom already stocked with books and globes and everything 2 growing boys might need for their education. And then he brought her to the West Wing, where she had once been confined, and she steeled herself for the rush of terrible memories. But when he opened the door, she found not the sparse prison cell of her nightmares, but a suite of rooms filled with light and flowers, the walls painted in soft colors that spoke of hope rather than punishment, and he said quietly, "I wanted to erase every shadow, to transform the place of my greatest sin into something beautiful for you. And I understand if you cannot bear to occupy these rooms, if the memories are too painful, and we can choose chambers elsewhere if you prefer." But Helena walked to the window that overlooked the gardens and realized that from this vantage she could see the entire estate spreading out in spring glory, and she turned to him and said that she would claim these rooms precisely because of their history, that she would fill them with love and laughter until no trace of sorrow remained, and the relief that washed over Sebastian's features made him look almost young again despite the silver in his hair. They renewed their wedding vows in Thornwood's private chapel 3 days after their return, with only the Dowager Duchess and Margaret as witnesses, and the twins sleeping in a basket near the altar, and Helena wore a gown of cream silk that Sebastian had commissioned specially for this moment. And when he slipped a new ring onto her finger beside the original band, she had never removed despite everything, his hands were steady and his voice was clear, as he promised before God to honor and cherish and trust her for all the days of his life. And she made the same promises in return, and she meant them with every fiber of her being. And that night, when he carried her across the threshold of their shared bedchamber, as though she were a bride in truth, rather than a wife reclaimed, their coming together was tender and healing, and shot through with an intimacy deeper than mere physical passion, and she wept in his arms afterward, not from sorrow but from the overwhelming recognition that they had survived the worst that pride and misunderstanding could inflict, and had emerged not broken but tempered into something stronger than they had been before. And as she fell asleep with her head pillowed on his chest and his arms wrapped protectively around her, she thought that perhaps some loves require destruction and rebuilding before they can achieve their truest form, and she was grateful beyond measure that they had been given this second chance to build their life together on foundations of forgiveness and hard-won trust. 5 springs had passed since Helena's return to Thornwood, and the estate that had once stood shrouded in mist and sorrow now bloomed with life and laughter, the gardens bursting with roses that Helena tended herself, and the halls echoing with the voices of children at play. And on this particular May afternoon, she stood on the terrace with Sebastian's arm warm around her waist as they watched Theodore and Alexander chase each other across the lawn with wooden swords, the boys now 5 years old and so alike in appearance that strangers could scarcely tell them apart, though Helena knew every distinction between them. Theodore's more serious nature and Alexander's quick laughter, and between them toddled 3-year-old Lily with her dark curls bouncing as she tried to keep pace with her brothers, calling out in her high voice for them to wait for her, and Sebastian pulled Helena closer against his side and pressed a kiss to her temple, and she leaned into him with the easy comfort of a wife who had learned to trust completely after having trust so thoroughly broken and then painstakingly rebuilt. The scars remained, of course, because some wounds leave marks no matter how thoroughly they heal. And there were still nights when Helena woke from dreams of locked doors and cold stone walls, and Sebastian would hold her until the trembling passed and whisper apologies he no longer needed to make, but offered anyway, because some sorrows deserve eternal acknowledgement, and she carried a wariness in her heart that had not existed before their destruction, a small, guarded place that remembered what it meant to be doubted by the one who should have trusted her most completely, But these scars had become part of their landscape rather than obstacles within it, integrated into the stronger foundation they had built together from the rubble of their first beginning. Sebastian had transformed in ways both visible and invisible, the arrogance that had once defined him replaced by a humility that made him beloved rather than merely respected in the county, and he consulted Helena on every decision affecting their household and estate, valued her opinions as he had never valued anything before losing her, and he doted on their children with a devotion that sometimes brought tears to Helena's eyes because she remembered the Duke, who had doubted whether Theodore and Alexander were even his, and that man seemed like a stranger now compared to the father who spent hours on the nursery floor building block towers and reading stories and teaching his sons to be gentle with their sister. Dear listener, if you have traveled with us through this tale of pain and healing, let me tell you what their story teaches us about the nature of love and forgiveness, because Helena and Sebastian's journey was not unique in its suffering but perhaps uncommon in its redemption, and there is wisdom here for all who have known the particular agony of being wounded by someone they love or who have been the one to inflict such wounds. Love alone is never enough to sustain a marriage or mend what pride and suspicion have broken, because love without trust is a beautiful prison, and trust once shattered requires patient reconstruction, brick by careful brick. And there are no shortcuts through the valley of reconciliation, no magic words that can dissolve the hurt or erase the memories of betrayal. But what Helena and Sebastian discovered was that transformation is possible when both parties choose humility over pride and patience over revenge, when forgiveness becomes not a single moment, but a daily practice of choosing grace over bitterness. If you find yourself in the ruins of broken trust, whether you are the wounded or the wounder, know that there is a path forward if you have courage enough to walk it, that some loves deserve a second chance, when genuine change and genuine remorse create new ground for growth. But know too that forgiveness does not require you to forget or to return to those who refuse transformation, that protecting your heart is not the same as hardening it, and that sometimes the bravest thing is to leave as Helena did, and sometimes the bravest thing is to return as she did when Sebastian proved himself worthy of that terrible gift. May you find the wisdom to know which path your story requires, and may you have the patience to let healing take the time it needs, and may you rest tonight in the knowledge that even the deepest wounds can close if tended with care and watered with tears that lead eventually to joy. And may your own journey toward peace be blessed with grace. This story comes to you from Everlasting Enchantment, where we believe in the power of transformation and the possibility of second chances, and we invite you to return for more tales of love tested and triumphant, because every heart deserves a story of hope.